Today I'm going to try to explain what emptiness is. Emptiness is an important realization in Buddhism, but you don't need to be Buddhist to appreciate it. To start, I want to do a short description of no self, because no self is a type of emptiness. So let's start with how your mind normally apprehends a person. When you consider somebody or look at someone, does it primarily feel like there's a bunch of atoms over there, or there's a bunch of color perceptions, or even that there is a biological organism acting in a predictable way in accordance to its environment? No, primarily it feels like there is a self over there. When you consider like yourself or a stranger or a family member, right? It feels like there's a self. What's the self? It's an apparent self. It feels like it is singular, like it exists over multiple moments in time, like it's distinct from the rest of the world. It feels independent, and it feels like it is the bearer of properties. So, for example, my haircut might change, so my property of hair length is different, but I'm the same, it would feel. Or like if I lose weight, my body composition changes, but I'm the same, right? It feels like selves are the unchanging haver of properties. Okay, and what I tried to show in my previous video is that if you look for a self which checks these boxes, either in your sensory experience or just considering it rationally, you can't find it. So it turns out the self that we seem to apprehend doesn't actually exist in the real world. What it is just a mental construction, something created by your own mind, which is then projected onto experience and falsely believed to be real, even though it's just a fictional thing. Hope that makes sense. Okay, now, in order to get to emptiness, let's take this idea of a self and generalize it. So when you generalize this self, it turns out self is a type of essence. So what's an essence? An essence is something which, like I said, it is singular, feels like it exists over multiple periods of time, is distinct from other things, independent, the bearer of properties. But try to imagine that, but not necessarily tied to a person or tied to like a personality. Just think of the idea of essence as a more general thing. Now, once we're equipped with this idea, it turns out that the mind apprehends essences in other things besides people. In basically everything, it turns out. So it feels like there are essences in non-human living things, in inanimate objects to some extent, and in things at the very general level of reality, like time, causation, change, motion, language, consciousness, mind, thoughts, external world. It feels like there are essences in all of these things. Again, it doesn't feel like there's a literal self there, like there's a self in a piece of wood or something like that, but some of those qualities that I listed seem to exist in all of these categories, and they seem to have this sort of firmness and independent nature to them. This is subtle, and it's hard for me to defend this because it would just take a long time to go through each category, so you have to kind of take my word for it that we essentialize these things. Okay, so now we can say what emptiness is. Emptiness is the absence of these essences. In the same way that the self turns out to not exist in the real world, but just be something your mind imagines, in the same way all of the apparent essences that you cognize don't actually exist. And so realization of emptiness is the experiential realization of that fact. Okay, now to close this video, I want to walk you through the emptiness of one of these categories I listed, but before that, I want to do a little detour to talk about where the idea of emptiness comes from and to acknowledge that people define it differently. So, very quick history. Emptiness can be traced down to the original historic Buddha, but around the year like 0 AD, there was this movement in Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism, and there was writings within Mahayana Buddhism called the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which talked a lot about emptiness. And so it became like a bigger focus around that time. And then around 200 AD, Nagarjuna came, and he's like, it's one thing to say that things are empty, but what if we actually use like rational philosophical argumentation to show that things are empty, right? To like prove their emptiness almost. And so that's what he kind of did with his writings, particularly his Mula Madhyamaka Karika, which was very influential. He's like arguably the second most important historical figure in Buddhism, Nagarjuna. Anyways, so when it comes to emptiness, he's usually where people look, and he's been interpreted in many different ways throughout history. Okay, so that's the history lesson. Now, the definition of emptiness I'm using in this video is to say that emptiness is the absence of intrinsic nature or the absence of essence. You could also say the absence of independent nature. These are all basically synonyms. This definition, as I understand, we get from mainstream Tibetan Buddhism. Another definition of emptiness I like is that emptiness is the suspension of views or the absence of beliefs about the nature of reality. We get this in Patsab Nyima Drakpa, who was an important Tibetan, and also in Thich Nhat Hahn. There's a video where he says that realization is freedom from views, and all views are wrong views. Another definition I like is that emptiness is the absence of reference points. To me, this speaks kind of to the experience of like what some realization of emptiness feels like. It's like the mind doesn't have anywhere to like grab onto. And I tend to see this with writers who come from the other Tibetan traditions of Buddhism. Okay, so enough of that. Now I'm going to try to show you the emptiness of causation. And this is the fun part of the video. In order I want you to actually feel the emptiness of causation to some degree. And what helps is if you do concentration meditation beforehand, if you have a regular schedule of doing like mindfulness of breathing, for example, because it makes your mind sharper and more sensitive to the way that it apprehends things. The way I'm going to do this is to use David Hume. So David Hume he was a Scottish philosopher around the 1700s, and I'm using him for two reasons. First, because he's not Buddhist, and I want to show that you don't need to be Buddhist to get this stuff. And second, because his thoughts about causation can be described very quickly. So let's do that now. Imagine that you're watching somebody play pool, and you see the following happen. You see the white ball hit the green ball, and the green ball moves. And you see this sequence again and again. So we can divide it into two events, right? Event A is white ball moves to the green ball and touches it. Event B is green ball moves. And while you're watching pool, you find that every single time you see A, then B happens right after. This seems like a very simple example of cause and effect. A is the cause, B is the effect, right? Well, what David Hume noticed is you're only experiencing two things. You only experience A and B. You don't experience a third thing called causation. Okay, let's dwell on that for a moment. And this applies not just to pool, but to every example I can think of apparent causation. All you experience is a sequence of events. You don't experience causation or what he would call necessary connection. Wow, isn't that interesting? Say you're hungry, you eat food, and then you're no longer hungry. We could describe that as a sequence of events with causal relations between them, or we could simply describe it as a sequence of events. You could perceive it just as a sequence of events. Interesting. Now this is the part of the video where I slow down a little bit because I get into kind of a meditative state, which I think is a good advertisement for this stuff. Okay, now you might think, okay, well maybe causation does exist, but it's like invisible. Okay, well, let's look at the standard model of physics. This lists the things that exist according to physics. There's like quarks and what are they, gluons or something? Do you see causation on that list? That's interesting. It's not on the list, right? Huh. Could you experience things without causation? Is causation real? How do we make sense of the apparent predictable nature of things? Huh. David Hume noticed, so let's go back to Hume, and I'm going to go past Hume with some of this stuff, so this isn't all Humean stuff. In philosophy, particularly in the past, philosophers wanted absolute certainty about things. In the same way that many would say 1 + 1 = 2 is an absolute certainty, they wanted to say, given A, I am certain that B will happen. But what David Hume is saying is you don't perceive something like that. You just perceive the sequence of things. It's conceivable that there could be a moment when A happens and B does not happen after, but maybe C happens instead. Maybe that already does happen, but we're just not paying attention at those moments. Or maybe every several billion years, the laws of physics change a little bit. And maybe at that point, a C will happen after A. These sound like far-fetched scenarios, but it's like logically possible, if that makes sense. You could conceive of these things happening. So it doesn't have that absolute objectivity that that some of these philosophers wanted. Huh. Here's another thing, which I think, for me, really seals the deal. Causation is an abstract relation. Abstract relations depend on a mind to exist. Therefore, causation, the appearance of causation, depends on your mind. Isn't that interesting? I keep saying, isn't that interesting? So what does the realization of the emptiness of causation look like? Well, it's like, instead of your experience being that there's a bunch of moments with causal relation, instead it's like there's a bunch of moments, full stop. Or notice, or you could just say there only is the present moment. Isn't that interesting? So in the present moment, have you noticed that? Have you noticed that in like meditation that people say, oh, there's just the present moment? Well, I guess if there's no causation, maybe that would be the resulting phenomenology, right? Like if there's no time, then and causation depends on time, then there's no causation. Now, so that's kind of what it looks like, right? That's what, as I think about it, the emptiness of causation is kind of like that. It's like you take off the mental input of causation, you remove that, but everything else kind of stays the same. Like there still is experience of stuff. And that's sort of a meditative realization, a shift in the way you experience things. But at the same time, it's a little bit more destructive than that, isn't it? Because think about all the places causation plays a role. you being affected by my video, you perceiving it implies causation. A previous thought you had affecting a current thought implies causation. Causation is like everywhere, isn't it? So to realize the emptiness of causation, it's kind of like those videos when they demolish a building and they blow up all these floors simultaneously. It's like you kind of, that structuring that your mind imposes is kind of being deconstructed. And that's kind of like a meditative understanding. Now I understand why a lot of the meditation teachers are really quiet and take long pauses in their videos. Yeah, I hope this connects with people. I know people come to this from super different backgrounds, and some people are so some people it's not going to hit them the way that it hits me. And I will say one thing for the skeptical, because some people are like, "This, come on, there's definitely causation. What are you talking about?" Well, first of all, everything I'm saying is compatible with the external world existing the way we normally perceive it to be. So that's a really long topic. But I like to have fun. I like to think like, maybe this is like maybe there just is this moment. I like to take it seriously. It's just like my personality. I don't mind like deconstructing everything. But you can, but you don't have to take it that far. And one way to view it is the way the Greeks, there's a word from Greek philosophy called aporia, which is sort of like this unresolvable like puzzle. And you can think of the emptiness of causation kind of like that. Like in one sense, it seems like it's definitely there, but in another sense, it seems like it's not there at all. And we just have to kind of live with that puzzle. You just kind of have to live with it. And again, maybe things are weird in the same way that like people are very tolerant for weird descriptions of like physics. I mean, you could say to a random person, "Are you cool with like string theory, multiple dimensions, parallel universes?" And they'll probably say, "Yeah, it's possible." In the same way, I want you to start to think that way about your reality, about reality itself. Like maybe things are just kind of different than we normally apprehend them to be. And then I think that can really lead to that sort of positive transformation.